one morning in the merry month of the May, the cocks were a-crowing, the lambs were at play. 'Twas their eyes by the female, so sweetly sang she, down by the green bushes, where she used to meet me. Good morning, please what she did say. Why are you walking alone all this day? I am looking for my true love, so sweetly sang she, down by the green bushes where you know me to be. I'll buy you fine clothing and a rich silk and a gown. I'll buy you fine flounces that hang to the ground. If you'll forsake your true love and come along with me, down by the green bushes where she used to meet me. I want none of your clothing, nor your silk and gown. I want none of your flounces that hang to the ground. But if you will proclaim and be honest and true, I'll forsake my own true love and get married to you. And if you will proclaim and be honest and true, I'll forsake my own true love and get married to you.
And if you was to walk through the bedrooms now, you'd see the ragged, mouldy bedclothes a-heaving and a-heaving like seas. And a-heaving with what? He says. Why, with the rats what's under 'em. But you see, was it the rats? I only ask because in another case, it was not. Now, I can't put a date to this story, but I was young when I heard it and the teller was old. I mean, it's an ill-proportioned tale, but that is my fault and not his. It happened in Suffolk, near the coast, in a place where the road makes a sudden dip and then a sudden rise. As you go northward at the top of this rise, a house stands on the left of the road, a tall red brick building, narrow for its height, probably built around 1770. Behind it are stables and offices and a small garden. Scraggy Scotch firs grow nearby, and an expanse of gorse-covered heath stretches away from it. The upper windows of the front of the building command a view of the distant sea, and a sign on a post stands near the door, or it did stand, because although it was once an inn of repute, I believe that it is no longer. Now, to this inn, my acquaintance, Mr. Thompson, came one fine spring day from the University of Cambridge. He was a young man, and he was desirous of solitude in tolerable quarters and time for reading. And these he found, because the landlord and his wife had been in service, and that they could make a visitor very comfortable. As there was no one else staying in the inn, he was given a large room on the first floor, which commanded the road and the view. And, well, if it faced east, that could not be helped. The house was well built and warm. Now, the days that followed his arrival were tranquil and uneventful. Work all morning, and then an afternoon perambulation of the country round, a little conversation with the people of the inn in the evening over the then fashionable drink of brandy and water, a little more reading and writing, and then bed. And young Mr. Thompson would have been very content that this should continue, because the full month was at his disposal, his work was progressing well, and the April of that year was a particularly fine one. One of his walks took him along the northern road, which stands high and traverses a wide heath. And on the bright afternoon which he first chose this direction, his eye was caught by a white object a few hundred yards off to the left of the road, and well, he felt compelled to find out what this might be. Soon he was standing next to it, and he found himself looking down at a square block of white stone, fashioned somewhat like the base of a pillar, and with a square hole cut in the upper surface. You can see one just like it to this day on Thetford Heath. After taking stock of this, he contemplated the view around him for a few moments, which offered a church tower or two, some red roofs of cottages winking in the sun, and the expanse of sea also with an occasional wink and gleam upon it. And then he pursued his way. Now, in the desultory talk in the bar that evening, he made some casual inquiries about the white stone that he'd seen on the common. "Oh, aye, sir, yes. An old-fashioned thing is that," said the landlord, Mr. Betts. "We was none of us alive when that was put there." "That's right," said another. "Yeah, well, it stands pretty high," said Mr. Thompson. I dare say that a sea mark was on it once." "Yes," Mr. Betts agreed. I have heard as they could see it from the boats. But whatever there was, it felt the bits a long time ago now." "Good job too," said a third. "'Tweren't a lucky mark, that, by what the old men used to say. Not lucky for the fishing, I mean." Why ever not?" said Thompson. "Well, I never seen it myself, but, they had some funny ideas, them old chaps. Peculiar, I mean. And I shouldn't wonder what they made away with it themselves." Oh, it was impossible to get anything clearer than this from them, and the company, which is never very voluble, fell silent. When someone spoke next, it was of village affairs and crops. Now, not every day did Thompson consult his health by taking a walk. One fine afternoon found him still busily writing at his table at 3 o'clock, at which time he stretched himself, rose, and walked out of the bedroom into the passageway. Now, facing him was another room, and then the stairhead, and then two more rooms, one looking out to the back, the other to the south. At the south end of the passage there was a window, and to this he wandered, reflecting that in fact it was rather a shame to waste such a fine afternoon in working. But, well, no, work was paramount just at the moment, and so he thought he'd just take 5 minutes off and then get back to it. And those 5 minutes he decided he would employ, and well, I mean, the Bettses couldn't possibly object, to looking at the other rooms in the passage, which he'd never seen. No one else was in the hotel, it seemed, except perhaps a maid in the bar. It was market day, you see, and they'd probably all gone to town. Very still, in fact, the house was, and the sun was shining really hot. Early flurries buzzed in the window panes. And so Mr. Thompson explored. The room facing his own was quite undistinguished, except for an old print of Bury St. Edmunds. The two next to him, on his side of the passage, were gay and clean, but with only one window apiece, whereas his had two. What remained was the southwest room, and this, he found, was locked. But you see, Well, Thompson was in a mood of quite indefensible curiosity that afternoon, and feeling confident that there could be no damaging secrets in a place so easily got at, he proceeded to fetch the key to his own room, and when that did not answer, to collect the keys of the other three. Now, one of them fitted, and he opened the door. Now, this new room, it had two windows looking south and west, so it was bright and the sun as hot upon it as could be. There was a bare floor, no carpet, no pictures, no washstand, in fact, only a bed in the farther corner, an iron bed with a mattress and a bolster covered with a bluish check counterpane. As featureless a room as one could imagine, and yet there was something about it that made Thompson close the door very quickly and very quietly behind him and lean against the windowsill in the passage, quivering all over. And it was this, that under that counterpane, someone lay. And not only lay, but stirred. Now, that it was someone and not something was certain, because the shape of the head was unmistakable on the bolster, and yet it was all covered up. And no one lies with a covered head but a dead person. And this was not dead, not truly dead, because it heaved and shivered. Now, had he seen these things at dusk, or by the light of a flickering candle, he could have comforted himself and talked of fancy. But on this bright, sunny, hot day, no, that was impossible. So what was to be done? Well, first of all, lock the door at all costs. Very gingerly he approached it, and bending down, he listened, holding his breath, and perhaps there might be a sound of heavy breathing and a prosaic explanation. But no, there was only silence, absolute silence. But then, as with a rather tremulous hand, he put the key into its hole and turned it, it rattled, and on the instant, a stumbling, padding tread was heard coming towards the door. Well, Thompson fled like a rabbit to his room and locked himself in, futile though he knew that was, because what would doors and locks be as an obstacle to what he suspected? Yet it was all that he could think of at the moment. And in fact, nothing further did happen. There was only a time of acute suspense, followed by a misery of doubt as to what to do next. I mean, the impulse, of course, was to slip away as soon as possible from a house which contained an inmate like that. And then, with that key that he had contrived to... He had, however, told the Betsy's, the landlords of the hotel, the night before that he was going to stay for the end of the week. Now, how could he possibly change that plan without inviting the suspicions that he had poked his nose into places where he ought not to have done? And so he decided that, in fact, the best possible course, the path of the least resistance, was to remain out the week. Now, he did this. He continued working. The weather remained fine. He went for walks, and he made sure that he did not pass the door once again. And yet, you see, his mind was constantly on the subject. What could it be that lay within there? He felt that he simply must take one more look. And so he came up with a plan. He decided that on the day of his departure, he would Well, he would make his farewells. He would arrange for a trap to take him to the railway station. And then, just before he departed, he would say that he would do one more check of his rooms to make sure that he'd not left a book there or anything. And then with the key to the door, which he had contrived to oil, as if that made any difference, the door should be opened once more for a moment. He would see what was in there, and then it was shut. And well, so his plan worked out. The day of his departure arrived. The bill was paid. The consequent small talk was gone through while the cart was loaded with his luggage. Pleasant part of the country. Yes, it's been very comfortable, Mr. Betts. I hope to come again sometime, on one side. And then on the other, well, we're very glad as you found satisfaction, sir. Me and my wife have done our best, and very much favoured we've been with the weather, haven't we, to be sure, etc., etc. And then I think I'll just take a last look upstairs in case I've left anything. Oh, no, please, it won't be any trouble. I won't be a moment. And then, as noiselessly as possible, he stole to the door of the room in the southwest corner and opened it. Oh, the shattering of the illusion. He almost laughed out loud because propped, or you might say sitting, on the edge of the bed was nothing in the round world but a scarecrow. It was a scarecrow out of the garden. Of course, it was dumped in the deserted room, but their amusement ceased. Because do scarecrows have bare, bony feet? Do their heads loll on their shoulders? Have they iron collars and links of chains about their necks? Can they get up and move, if never so stiffly, across a floor, with wagging head and arms close at their sides? Can they shiver? The slam of the door, the dash to the stairhead, the leap downstairs were followed by a faint awakening. Thompson saw Mr. Betts's face looming over him, holding a brandy bottle and looking very reproachful. You oughtn't to have done that, sir. Really, you oughtn't to have done that. It ain't a kind way to act by persons as have done the best as they could for you. Now, Thompson heard words of this kind, but what he said in reply, he did not know. Mr. Betts, and perhaps even more Mrs. Betts, found it hard to accept his apologies and his assurances that he would say no word that could damage the good name of the house. However, they were eventually accepted. Now, since the train could not now be caught, it was arranged that Thompson should be driven to the nearest town to sleep there. But before he went, the Bettses told him what little they knew. They say that he was landlord here a long time back, and he was in with the highwaymen that had their beat up on the heath. That's how he come by his end. Hung in chains, they say, up where you see that stone where the gallows stood. Oh, the fishermen made away with that, you see, because they could see it from their boats, and it kept the fish off, according to their ideas. We have the account from the people as had the house before we came. Now, you keep that room shut up, he says, but don't you move that bed out, and you'll find there won't be no trouble. And no more has there been any trouble. Not once hasn't he come up into this house. Though what he may do now, Mr. Thompson, there's no saying. Anyway, you're the first one I know of has seen him since we've been here. I never set eyes on him myself, nor I don't want to neither. And since we made the servants' rooms in the stabling way, I had no difficulty that way. Only I do hope, sir, you will keep a close tongue, considering our house can get talked about. Well, the promise of silence was kept for many years. The occasion of my hearing the story was this, that when Mr. Thompson came to stay with my father one time, it fell upon me to show him to his room. And you see, instead of letting me open the door for him, He stepped forward and flung it open himself. And then for some moments he just stood in the doorway, holding up his candle and looking narrowly into the interior. And he seemed to recollect himself. "Oh, I beg your pardon, boy. It's very absurd, I realise, but I can't help doing that for a particular reason." Now, what that reason was, I heard some days afterwards, and you have heard now. There's nothing more common in these old-fashioned books than the description of the winter fireside, where the aged grandam narrates to the circle of children that hang upon her lips story after story of ghosts and fairies, and inspires in her audience a pleasing terror. But you see, we're never allowed to know what those stories were. Oh, it's true, yes, we hear of sheeted spectres with saucer eyes, and still more intriguing, of raw head and bloody bones. Now, that is an expression which, in fact, the Oxford Dictionary tells us goes back as far as 1550. But you see, the context of these striking images, it eludes us. And this is a problem that I admit has long obsessed me. And you see, I see no obvious means of resolving it. The aged grandams have all gone, of course, and the collectors of folklore began their work in England too late to save most of the stories which the grandams told. And yet, you see, such things do not easily die quite out. An imagination working on scattered hints may be able to devise a picture of, an evening's entertainment. So I'd like to let us try now. So picture the scene. There's a squire, exhausted by a long day after partridge and replete with food and drink, is snoring on one side of the fireplace. His old mother sits opposite him, knitting, and the children, Charles and Fanny, are gathered about her knee. "Now, my dears, you must be very good and quiet, or you'll wake your father, and you know what'll happen then. I know, Granny, he'll be woundy cross-tempered and send us off to bed." "Charles, fie upon you! That is no way for a little boy to speak. Now, I was going to have told you a story, but if you use words like that, then I certainly shan't." "Oh, Granny, please, I'm sorry." "Now, you be good and sit still now, and you too, Fanny. And I'll tell you what, tomorrow you shall go a blackberrying. And if you bring home a nice basket full of blackberries, I'll make you some jam." "Oh, Granny, please, yes, do. And I know where the best blackberries are. I saw them today." "Oh? And where's that, boy?" "Well, in the little lane that goes up past Mrs. Collins's cottage." "No, child. No. Don't you dare to pick one single blackberry in that lane. Now, do you hear me now? Why, you've no idea." "No, well, of course you've no idea. But anyway, mind what I say, and you leave that lane well alone." But why, Granny? Why shouldn't we pick blackberries there?" "Your father's sleeping." "But Granny..." All right. I'll tell you all about it, only you mustn't interrupt me, all right? Now, let me see. Well, you see, it was when I was quite a little girl. That lane had a bad name, although it seems that people don't remember much about it these days. And one day I told my poor mother when I came home for supper, it was a summer evening, I remember. I told her I'd been for my walk and how I'd come back down that lane. And I asked her how it was that there was those currant and gooseberry bushes growing in a little patch at the top of the lane. And oh, dear me, what a taking she was in. She shook me, she slapped me, And she says, "You naughty, naughty child. Haven't I forbid you 20 times over to set foot in that lane? And here you go dawdling down it at night time." And well, when she'd finished, I was almost too taken aback to say anything, but I made her believe that was the first I'd heard of anything, and well, that was the truth then. And then, you see, of course, she was very sorry that she'd been short with me, and to make up, she told me the whole story about that lane after my supper. And since then, I've often heard similar things from the old people of the place, and well, I had my own reasons for thinking there might be something in it. Now, you see, up at the far end of that lane, now, is it on the left or the right as you go up? It's the left, I think, yes. You'll find a little patch of bushes and rough ground in the field and something like a broken hedge about it. And you'll notice that some old gooseberry and currant bushes are growing among it. Well, you see, that means that there was a cottage that once stood there. And in that cottage, before I was born or thought of, there lived a man named Davis. Now, I've heard that Davis wasn't born in the parish, and it's true that nobody of that name has been living about here since I've known the place. But however that may be, this Mr. Davis, well, he lived very much to himself, you see. Very seldom went to the public house, and he never worked for any of the farmers. It seemed that he had enough money of his own to get along. But he'd always go to town on market days, you see. And one day he comes back from the market bringing a young man with him. And this young man and Mr. Davis, they lived together for a very long time. And they went about together always. And whether he did the work of the house for Mr. Davis, or whether Mr. Davis was a teacher in some way, nobody seemed to know. I heard that he was a pale, ugly young fellow, hadn't much to say for himself. Well, now, what did these two men do with themselves? I mean, of course, I can't tell you half the foolish things that people got into their heads. And as we know, don't we mustn't speak evil of things that we don't know are true, even when people are dead and gone. But as I said, these two men were always about together, late and early. They were up on the downland or they were down below in the woods. And there was one walk in particular that they take regularly, once a month, to the place where you'll have seen that old figure cut into the hillside. And it was noticed that in the summertime, when they took that walk, they'd camp out all night, either there or somewhere else nearby. I remember once my father, he told me that he'd spoken to Mr. Davis about it. It was my father's land that Davis lived on. And he asked him why he was so fond of always going up there. But all Mr. Davis would say was, well, that's a wonderful old place, sir. And I've always been fond of the old-fashioned things. And when me and him, and he meant the young man, are up there together, it seems to bring the old times back so plain. And my father said, well, it might suit you, Mr. Davis, but I shouldn't like a lonely place like that in the middle of the night myself. And Mr. Davis smiled, and the young man who'd been listening said, "Oh, we don't want for company at such times, sir." And father said that he couldn't help thinking Mr. Davis then made a sign of some kind with his hand. And then the young man went on quick, as if to mend his words. Or that is to say, Mr. Davis and me's company enough for each other, ain't we, master? And then there's such a beautiful air there of a summer night. And you can see all the country round for miles under the moon. And it looks so different to what it do in the daytime. Why, them barrows out on the dawn. And then Mr. Davis cut in rather quickly and said, "Oh, aye, they're old-fashioned places, aren't they? Now, what would you think would be the purpose of them barrows, sir?" "Well," said my father, I have heard that they're graves. And indeed, when I have had the occasion to plough one up, there's always been some old bones or pots turned up. Well, whose graves they were is quite another matter. People say that the ancient Romans were hereabouts at one time, but whether they buried their people like that, I'm afraid I've no idea. And Mr. Davis shook his head and said, "No, yes, they look to me to be older than the ancient Romans, sir. I dressed different. That is to say, according to the pictures. You know, the Romans was in armour, and you never found no armour, did you, sir? My father was rather surprised, and he said, no, I don't believe I did mention anything about armour, no. But it's true, I don't remember to have found any. But sorry, you rather talk as if you'd seen them yourself, Mr. Davis. And they both laughed then, you see, Mr. Davis and the young man. And Mr. Davis said, seen them, sir? Well, that would be a difficult matter after all these years, wouldn't it? Not that I shouldn't like well enough to know more about them old times, and the people and what they did, and what they worshipped and all. Worshipped? Said my father. Well, I dare say that they worshipped the old man up on the hill. Ah, yes, indeed, said Mr. Davis. Indeed, I shouldn't wonder if they did. And my father went on and told them that he'd heard and read about the heathens and their sacrifices. And, well, they seemed to be very much interested, Mr. Davis and the young man, in what my father said. But my father said that he couldn't help thinking that most of what he was selling was of no news to them. Now, you see, that was the only time that he had much talk with Mr. Davis, but it stuck in his mind, he said, particularly when the young man said something about not wanting for company. Because, you see, in those days, there was a lot of talk in the villages round and about. And, well, I mean, yes, but for my father interfering, the people here would have ducked an old lady for a witch. What does that mean, Granny? Ducked an old lady for a witch? Are there witches around here? Oh, no, Charles. Oh, no, my dear. No, that's quite another affair. So I shouldn't have mentioned it. No. What I mean is that the people in other places round about, well, they believe that some sort of meetings went on at night time on that hill, you know where the big man is. And those who went up there were up to no good. Well, anyway, I suppose it was a matter of about 3 years that Mr. Davis and his young man went on living together. And then all of a sudden, a really dreadful thing happened, which I don't think I should tell you about. Oh, Granny! No, you must! No, it's too much for young ears. Oh, Granny, please, all right. But you must promise that you're not going to get frightened and go screaming out in the middle of the night. Very well, then. Well, one morning, early towards the turn of the year, I think it was September, it was about this time of year, one of the woodmen had to go up to his work at the top of the long covert, just as it was getting light. And just where there were some big oaks in a sort of a clearing deep in the wood, he saw at a distance a white thing that looked like a man through the mist. Well, I mean, he was in two minds about going on, but go on he did. And he made out as he came near that it was a man. And more than that, it was Mr. Davis's young man, dressed in a sort of a white gown he was, and hanging by his neck to the limb of the biggest oak, dead. Oh, yes. No, he was quite dead. And near his feet there lay on the ground a hatchet, all in a gore of blood. Well, I mean, the poor woodman was almost out of his wits, of course, wasn't he? He dropped what he was carrying, he ran as hard as he could to the parsonage, and he woke them up and he told them what he'd seen. And old Mr. White, of course, who was the parson back then, he sent him off to get 2 or 3 of the best men, the blacksmith and the church wardens and whatnot, while he dressed himself. And then they all went up to this dreadful place, and they took a horse to lay the body on to bring it back. And when they got there, everything was just as the woodman had said. And a terrible shock it was to see how the corpse was dressed, especially to old Mr. White, because it seemed to him, he told my father, to be like a mockery of the church surplice, only not in the same fashion of it. And then they came to take the body down from the oak and they found that there was a chain of some metal around the young man's neck, and a little ornament like a wheel hanging to the front of it. It was a very old-looking thing, they said. Now, in the meantime, they'd sent off a boy to run to Mr. Davis's house and to see whether he was at home. And Mr. White said that they must send for the constable too and get a message to a magistrate. And so, of course, there was a good deal of running hither and thither. And when they laid the dead body across the horse, it was all they could manage to keep the beast from bolting away. But eventually they got it down through the wood and back into the village street. And there, just by the big tree where the stocks are, they found a lot of women gathered together. And this boy, who they'd sent to Mr. Davis's house, was lying in the middle of the street, white as paper, trembling, and not a word could they get out of him. Well, they guessed, of course, that there was something worse to come. And they made their way up the lane to Mr. Davidson's house. And when they got near it, that horse, it seemed to go mad with fear, reared up, screamed, struck out with its forefeet, and the man that was leading it was as near as possible as being killed, and of course the dead body fell off its back. So Mr. White bid them to take the horse away, and they carried the body into the living room because the door stood open. And then they saw what it was that had given that poor little boy such a fright, and why the horse had gone mad. You see, there was a long table in the room, and on it lay the body of Mr. Davis. The eyes were bound over with a linen band, and the arms were tied across the back, and the feet were bound together with another band. But the fearful thing was that the breast was bare, and the bone of it had been split open with an axe. Oh, that was a terrible sight, of course. And not one there but turned faint with it and had to go out into the fresh air. Even Mr. White, who was what you might call a hard nature of a man, even he was overcome, and he went out into the garden and said a prayer for strength. Well, at last they laid out the other body in the room as best they could, and they searched about to see if they could find out how such a frightful thing had come to pass. And in the cupboards, you see, they found a quantity of herbs and jars with liquors in them. And it came out, when people that understood such matters had looked into it, that some of these liquors were drinks that would put a person to sleep. And they had little doubt that that wicked young man had put some of this into Mr. Davis's drink and had used him as he did, and after that the sense of sin had come upon him and he cast himself away. Well, all right, now you couldn't understand all the law business that had to be done by the coroner and the magistrates and so forth, but there was a great coming and going in the village over the next day or two. And then the people of the parish got together and they agreed that they could not bear the thought of these two men being buried in the churchyard alongside Christian people. Because I must tell you, you see, that there were certain papers and writings that had been found in the drawers and the cupboards of that cottage. And Mr. White and some other clergymen put their names to a paper that said that these men were guilty by their own allowing of the dreadful sin of idolatry. And they feared that there were also some in the neighbouring places that were not entirely free from that wickedness themselves, and they called upon them to repent, lest the same fearful thing that had come to these men should befall them also. And then they burnt all those wicked, horrible writings. And so then, late one evening, 12 men went with Mr. White to that evil house, and with them they took 2 beers and 2 pieces of black cloth. And down at the crossroads, where you take the turn to Bascombe and Wilcombe, there were other men waiting with torches, and a pit had been dug, and a great crowd of people gathered round from all about. And the men that went to the cottage, they went in with their hats on their heads, and 4 of them took the two bodies and laid them on the biers and covered them with the black cloths. And all this time, no one said a word, you see, but they bore them down the lane and they cast them into the pit, covered them with stones and earth. And then Mr. White spoke to the people that were gathered there. I know all this because my father, he was there himself, you see, and he said that he would never forget the strangeness of that sight. You know, the torches burning and those two black things huddled together in the pit, and not a sound from any of the people, except it might be a child or a woman whimpering with fright. And so when Mr. White had finished speaking, they all turned away and they left the man lying there. And you see, they say that even now, horses, they don't like that spot. And I've heard that there was something of a mist or a light hung about for a long time afterwards. But of course, I don't know the truth of that either. But I do know this, that the next day, my father's business took him past the opening of the lane, and he saw 3 or 4 little knots of people standing at different places along it, seemingly in a state of mind about something. And he rode up to them and he asked them what was the matter. And they ran up to him and they said, "Oh, Squire, it's the blood. Look at the blood." And so he got off his horse and they showed him. And there, in 4 different places, I think it was, he saw these great patches of blood on the road, but he could hardly see that it was blood because almost every spot of it was covered with great black flies that never changed their position. They never moved. And that blood was what had fallen out of Mr. Davis's body. As they bore it down the lane. Well, I mean, my father, he couldn't bear to do more than just take in the nasty sight. And then he said to one of those men that was there, he said, "Hurry up and fetch a barrow of clean earth out of the churchyard and spread it over these places. And I'll wait here till you come back." And very soon the man came back, and he brought the sexton with him with a shovel and the earth from the churchyard in a hand barrow. And they set it down at the first of the places, and they made ready to cast the earth upon it. And as they had the soil on the shovel, what do you think happened? The flies that were on it rose up into the air like a solid cloud and moved off up the lane towards the house. And the sexton stopped and he looked at them, and then he said to my father, "Lord of the Flies, sir." And that's all he said. Wouldn't say any more. Just Lord of the Flies. What did he mean, Granny? What, Lord of the Flies? Oh, Stephen. Well, my dear, you must ask Mr. Lucas when you go to him for your lesson tomorrow. Anyway, the next thing was, my father made up his mind that no one was going to live in that cottage again, although, in fact, it was one of the best in the place. So he sent round word to the people that it was to be done away with, and anyone that wished could bring a faggot for the burning of it. And that is what was done. Yes, no, they built a pile of wood in the living room, loosened the thatch so that the fire could take a good hold, and set it alight. And soon it was all gone. Apart from the brick chimney. I remember seeing that blackened brick chimney, and as a little girl. But you see, after a while, even that fell down of its own accord. Well, for a long time afterwards, as you may guess, folks said that Mr. Davis and his young man were seen about the place. One of them in the wood, and both of them where the house had been, or passing down the lane together, particularly in the spring and at the autumn time. Now, I can't speak of that, of course. I was too young. Although I got to say that if there are such things as ghosts, it would seem likely that people like that would not rest quiet. But I can tell you this, that one evening in the month of March, this was just before your grandfather and I were married, We'd been taking a long walk in the woods together, picking flowers and talking as young people will at a courting. And there, well, we were so much taken with each other that we took no particular notice of where we were going. And suddenly I cried out, "Ah!" And your grandfather asked me what was the matter. And the matter was that I had felt a sharp prick on the back of my hand. And I snatched it to me, and I saw a black thing on it, and I struck it with the other hand and killed it. And I showed it to your grandfather, and he said, "My word, I've never seen a fly like that before." And we looked at it, and then we looked around us, and, well, if we were not in the very lane just in front of the place where that house had stood, and as they told me later, just where the men set down the biers a minute when they bore those wicked men out of the garden gate. Well, you can be sure, of course, your grandfather and I, we made haste away from there without delay. Now, whether there was anything about more than we could see, I can never be sure. Perhaps it was partly the venom of that horrid fly's bite, but I felt very, very strange because, God, and dear me, that my poor arm and hand, how they swelled up. I'm afraid to tell you how large it got around, and the pain of it too. Nothing my mother could do had any power, and it wasn't until she persuaded by our old nurse to get the wise man over at Bascombe to come and look at it that I got any peace at all. But you see, the wise man, he seemed to know all about it, and he said that I wasn't the first that had been taken that way. When the sun is gathering his strength, he said, and when he's in the height of it, and when he's beginning to lose his hold, and when he's in his weakness, them that haunts about that lane had best take heed of themselves. Well, what it was that he bound my arm with, and what he said over it, he wouldn't tell us. But soon after that, sure enough, I got well again. And since then, I've heard enough of people suffering the same way as I did. Only of late, you see, it doesn't seem to happen, but very seldom. And I suppose that maybe, in fact, things like that do die out over the course of time. But you see, Charles, that's the reason I tell you that I will not have you gathering blackberries nor eating them in that lane. And now, when you've heard all about it, I don't fancy you'll want to yourselves. Now, go on. Off to bed this minute. What? A light on in your room? The idea of such a thing. You get yourself undressed and say your prayers. And perhaps, if your father doesn't want me when he wakes up, I will come up and say good night to you. And Charles, if I hear anything of you frightening your little sister on the way up to bed, I shall tell your father that very moment, and you know what happened to you last time. Well, the door closes, and Granny, after listening intently for a minute or two, resumes her knitting. On the other side of the fireplace, the squire slumbers on.